on time. And when you walk in late, like some other people, then you realize you have to be here on time. I'm teasing you because you are usually on time. So anyway, so we are called to order. At your desk, you can see some minutes. And these were from our short little meeting at the rail we had one day. I'll give you guys a chance to read them. And if anybody has any corrections or additions they'd like to offer. Would anybody like to make a motion? Thank you. And is there a second? Second by Representative McNorton. Last chance for discussion. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. And opposed, same side. Okay, and the minutes are adopted. All right, so we are going to have discussion and action on SB 45, and I'm going to open the discussion with saying that I had mentioned to you before that there was a paragraph that I found awkward to read, and I think it really was awkward because it's almost like a double negative, and I asked Jason to make a balloon on that, and we're going to pass that balloon on, and I'm going to allow Jason to present the amendment. Yeah. Jason, would you like to explain the amendment?
Madam Chair, members of the committee, the amendment appears there, as you see on page 1 of the bill, lines 11 through 16. This is essentially changing that paragraph A in line 12 from being a statement about including students to a statement about excluding students so that it matches up with paragraph B, so that the language reads a little bit clearer, so that the alternative graduation be a graduation rate determined by excluding, 1, students who are enrolled in the school district, who had transferred to the school district after completing grade 8 and who had not earned sufficient credits to be expected to graduate in the same year as their cohort. So that's the insufficient credits to graduate on time exclusion. And then B also would be excluding those students who were enrolled in the school but subsequently transferred to a non-accredited private school in Kansas or another state. That is the new language that would be added to the law that isn't currently in law right now. And so the change doesn't necessarily affect anything substantively in how the alternative graduation rate is to be calculated for schools. It's simply changing the language so that both paragraphs A and B there read roughly in the same manner as an exclusion of students when calculating that alternative graduation rate.
Thank you, Jason. And just for the background of the committee, I did speak with Travis Lowe and Shannon Kimball. Both of them had played a role in, Travis brought us the bill and Shannon inspired the amendment. So I did let both of them take a look at it. They agree that it doesn't change the intent. And I'm happy to discuss the amendment. Any questions? Okay, we're really quiet today. All right, yes, Kyle. Go ahead.
Madam Chair, I make a motion we accept the amendment as presented.
Is there a second? Representative Pishney. Any further discussion? All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Opposed, same sign. Okay, that motion carries. Is there further discussion on the bill, or does anybody else have any amendments? Seeing none, a motion to move the bill favorably. comes from Representative Hubert. And is there a second? Representative Brantley. Any further discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor, please say aye. Opposed, same sign, and that motion carried. Oh, I'm sorry. Were there people who wanted to be recorded? Featherston, anybody else? And you were recorded as a no? And Stogstill as a no? Ruiz as a no? Miller is a no. Anybody else who would like their vote recorded? Okay, then we will move on and get to our presentation, and I'm going to kick that off by welcoming State Board of Education Chair Kathy Hopkins to be here with us on this discussion of while we get an update on accreditation. You may. You're welcome. Okay. Any other changes before we get going? Okay. It's my fault that your agenda reads a little bit wrong. We have Dr. Ben Proctor with us on one of our last opportunities to have him with us to get into a more in-depth conversation about KESA. KESA and Ben, take it away. Thank you for being with us today.
Okay, thank you, Madam Chair and members of the committee. It is an honor to be with you, and very happy to have our State Board Chair, Mrs. Hopkins, with us. She could easily do this presentation, as she has learned over time all the details of our accreditation system. Also, I have my colleague, Dr. Jay Scott. He's Kansas's own Dr. J, as I like to call him, and we'll be sharing in some of our presentation here. I did want to open things up. It is Read Across America Week, and I think a relevant component of what we're going to be sharing with you today as we talk about school improvement and accreditation in Kansas. So just excited about that, excited about the things that are happening in our schools. Just to give a little bit of background, I've been with KSD now for almost 3 years. And I like to tell people coming from the school world, it took me a little while to kind of get my feet under me at KSD and understand state level work. And I remember in those first few months trying to understand all the things that we do. And I remember Dr. Watson early on as I was moving into the role calling accreditation kind of the big lift. Of all the things that I needed to learn mostly about that. And I had a lot of background with accreditation, having worked in school systems and understood how that looked prior, and knowing that we wanted to make some changes, and I was very blessed to be able to join Dr. J as he leads the accreditation process at the State Department, and we began work at that point. But I wanted to pose to the committee where we started, and we started with what I would describe as the problem when I think about school improvement. I think about improving outcomes for our students. And we started with a term, and it was actually coined in a book that we studied together as a director team at KSD called Coherence. And on pages 19 and 20 of this book by Michael Folan, he describes from his point of view the problem, and we felt connected to that problem. And just to summarize what he says here is in our schools, we often try to do so many things. We try to do all the good things, and oftentimes that leads us to not doing anything exceedingly well. And I would describe this as kind of resonating with my experiences as a teacher and a building leader and a district leader, and then as a state leader and somebody who gets to really understand what we're doing to situate work across Kansas. I really do see this as the problem, and we situated that problem 3 years ago and began the work of trying to not be a part of that problem or be a contributing factor to that problem. And we operated within a framework to start moving away from the problem to how we can solve the problem. And this is really an invitation to the committee. As you hear the details of this, an opportunity for all of us to really understand this idea of coherence. And it starts with the direction. Do we know clearly where we want to go? And you're going to hear us talk a lot about instruction, classroom instruction today, which is kind of a paramount feature of our school improvement focus as we move forward. We also wanted to build what Folan described as a culture of collaboration. And you'll hear us distinguish where we've been versus where we are now and where we want to go in the future. And this accreditation model that we described to you today is very different. And we're in the first year. We are implementing now. So we spent the last 2 years plus really building this approach, and now we're executing on that. And it really does embrace this idea of collaborating together, having conversation. You'll hear us talk about how that wasn't necessarily a big part of our prior model. And then instructional focus. There is a heavy instructional focus, which means supporting our classroom teachers in doing a small number of things very, very well. And accountability is a final component of that framework, and understanding that we need school systems to have internal accountability for their work, and then at the state level providing some external accountability to that work. And that's really where we started, and you're going to hear us talk about the result of that work and how we're executing on that moving forward. But we started with the problem. We try to do so many things. So in the Division of Learning Services, which is the division that I get to work with at KSDE, there's about 130 of us. And as a result of the collaborative process that we employed within the agency to say, how do we start solving this issue of trying to do so many things that are often disconnected from one another, we developed a theory of action that basically says, if we can build coherence, if we can understand that we can all move in the same direction, and we can focus on the small number of things that the evidence and research would say are very likely to produce results, and do those things exceedingly well, we believe our kids will ultimately no more be able to do more, and we can reduce limitations that we currently see and maximize opportunities. And we like that term fundamental. And we're going to talk a little bit about the document that you have in front of you today, and on the left side you'll see how we've defined these fundamentals. We've got 4 of them, and we believe that each school system needs to account for these 4 things, and we're going to get into the details of that this afternoon. So as a result of really identifying a problem, establishing a theory of action that can clearly identify the actions that we need to take to improve outcomes for our students, this is where there's been a shift in our work at KSD under the guidance of our state board, our Commissioner of Education. So some principles that really guide the work that we're currently engaged in with our schools. And the first principle that we established from the outset was we're going to have a high accountability model. And it's going to be accountability for the actions that we can control, that we can take. And in order to have high accountability, especially employ that external accountability, we need to make sure that we have the supports available to any school system that needs those supports to do that work very well. So this is all about the actions that we control, the professional actions, the adult behaviors that will lead to better outcomes for our students, and we want to have supports for each of those things. And I'm very excited to say that those supports are available now, and we're continuing to build those as we move this model forward. Additionally, we're going to focus on instruction, and it's going to be about conversation and collaboration. And you'll hear us talk about the different engagements that we have. And in the old model, just to distinguish where we've been versus where we are, and Jay will talk a little bit about this, but there wasn't real accountability for an accreditation determination in the previous model for about 6 years. So schools could work year after year after year, and no determination was going to be made after at least 5 years, possibly 6 years. We've got checks in this model every 6 months, and we'll talk a little bit about what those checks look like. But it's through collaboration. We sit down with our school systems and engage in conversation, and we feel like that's where the work will occur. It's not through big reports or just telling us what you're doing. We want to sit down and talk about it and see the work that you're doing. We're going to focus, like I said, on professional actions. These actions are all around these fundamentals, and they're interconnected. They work together. You don't just train people to teach literacy. You have to combine that with other actions to support implementation of that. If you've ever been involved in professional learning, you know that it's all about implementation of that. And that's what this model creates and the conversation that we have creates. We will sustain it through our theory of action. I was recently with some school leaders who had engaged in this collaborative process that we've rolled out this year, and we have received very positive feedback. We believe we have good, positive momentum right now. And for those of us that have been around a while, the question is, when's this going to change? Because we are constantly in a cycle of change. And I don't believe that we have to change this. I think we found something that we can sustain and will be meaningful in terms of outcomes for our kids, and we have to keep it very simple. And we feel like we've captured these things, but this is really how our work has changed as a result of this new accreditation approach that we've begun this year. So I'm going to let Jay talk about what we call the nuts and bolts of KISA 2.0.
Let me lower the mic. Ben always refers to me as Dr. J, and I always laugh because if you look at the two of us, there's one of us that resembles a little bit more a likeness of Dr. J, who was an excellent basketball player, very tall, Ben, right? So thank you for the time today. It's great to be with the committee. As Ben said, really the nuts and bolts of accreditation. So there are 3 areas that we look at, and this is system level accreditation. So it is not just a building level, it's a system level. So if you think about a Auburn-Washburn, here Southwest Topeka, they have several buildings, right? They are it's one accreditation rating for Auburn-Washburn as a system. So to be clear, we look at 3 things. We look at compliance, so those applicable state and federal laws and statutes that schools have to comply with. We look at that every year. We look at school improvement, which is what Ben was just talking about. It's really about the action systems are taking to improve student outcomes. It's about instruction. It's about teaching kids to read. It's those critical fundamental actions that we must master if we're going to see kids have better outcomes. So school improvement is all about action and the best research out there in terms of fundamental actions. And then outcomes, I kind of like to think of it as a little bit of an equation. You know, compliance is really that foundational pieces you have to have in place. School improvement is the actual work of teaching and learning. When you add those 2 together, you get good results. And so we will talk about each of these 3. So in each area, and they are not distributed differently, they are all equally important in an accreditation decision, all 3. And so when we talk about those, we have set a standard in each of those areas, a way to measure that. And again, as Ben said, this is a yearly accreditation decision. KISA 1.0 was set to be a 5-year, and then COVID happened and it ended up being 6 years. So in a 6-year time span, systems accounted 1 time in 6 years for these 3 things. We're talking about accountability every year in all 3 areas. And so we're setting a standard, a way to measure that, and then as Ben said, we're done with holding systems accountable for things that we cannot directly support. So we had to limit down to those most critical things that we know we could provide supports to school systems for. So just the roles, the major players, I'll say that, in accreditation. So the districts themselves, basically what they need to do in each of those 3 areas each year is report required information. Now, in compliance, that looks different because there are several different compliance areas. But in school improvement, yes, we're saying report, but if any of you are familiar with KISA 1.0, that was a yearly 30 to 50 page report that systems would send in every year. And to the point where we heard from systems, we're doing so much time reporting, we're not doing the actual work of school improvement. So we're returning that to systems. The action plans that Ben referred to, those are maximum 2 to 3 page reports. And so where's the time spent? The time is in the conversation. I was a teacher once for a while, and one of the things I always remembered in my, as I learned as a young teacher moving into more the veteran teaching side, kids would approach an assessment differently. If it was a written assessment that I was only going to be the only one to see it and grade it, they approached that differently as having to stand up in front of their peers and present, right? There was more accountability on them when there was a bigger audience. The same thing holds true for our systems. When you have to sit down with 3 to 5 like systems, all right, in your area, maybe in your league, and you have to talk about school improvement, it creates a different dynamic of that conversation. Instead of just a passive, we're going to send this report to somebody at KSDE to read. There's a lot more accountability built into this. So on the school improvement side, less reporting, more conversation, more accountability. The outcome side really hasn't changed much, and systems really don't have to report that. It's all public. It's all part of public reporting. KSDE, largely in the previous model, was not involved. A very passive role from KSDE. So we flipped the script. Through Ben's leadership, we have decided that school improvement instruction is key. And so all of our supports are built up, and we're entering into this process a lot more where we actually analyze information coming in from systems in terms of school improvement, and then we share that with what we call the ARC. Okay, the ARC is the Accreditation Review Council. It is an 18-member board, educators from all across the state, multiple geographic locations represented on that committee, different positions in education. They serve as the group, the third party that looks at what systems submit, the information from us, from KSDE, and then they actually are the group that makes a recommendation to the State Board of Accreditation. And the ARC before was really just taking a look at all the reports that would come in. They would review every system, right, once in a 6-year time span. So now we're positioning the ARC to be more of a support. What we'd like to do is have the ARC be a support for the systems that most need support. So they'll still be reviewing every system every year, but they'll really be focused on those that are not what we call meeting the standards in one of those 3 areas. And then ultimately the state board is the group that determines an accreditation status for a district. So this is our timeline, and this is just for the next 3 years. It will continue. We'll continue to build this out. But for the timeline, as Ben said, it started this year. KISA, what we call 2.0, started this year. And again, stressing these are yearly evaluations. So this year, we will be reviewing every one of our 304 systems that are in accreditation. We'll review them for compliance in each of the 14 compliance areas. In school improvement, what will be evaluated is every system this year, their whole outcome for school improvement is to develop what we call a quality action plan. And we can share these action plans with your committee so you can see what we're talking about. But basically, they're to put together a quality action plan where they identify 1 or 2 fundamentals that they really want to focus on for the next year. Outcomes, we will have systems report those as they have before. We will not be evaluating outcomes this year for an evaluation determination. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. Year 2, same thing on compliance. In next year, 25-26, for school improvement now, they put together an action plan. Excuse me. Next year when we get back together, they will be reporting out on implementation. And again, not through some report to KSDE, will actually be through a conversation. This is how it went. This is what we intended to do, and this is how it turned out. So it's really getting down into the details of what systems are actually doing, much more so than in models past. Same thing for outcomes. They would report on those outcomes. And then in year 3, all 3 areas would be evaluated. And if we had a year 4 up there for 27-28 and 28-29, you would see the same report and evaluate. We would evaluate every year, all 3 areas. The reason we delayed the outcomes, results, evaluation is because if you look at implementation science, when you start something, there's about a 3 to 5 year window that shows that you can't really attach the results from that until you've implemented it for 3 to 5 years. So what we're doing is evaluating and holding accountable systems for the action they're taking, and then the subsequent outcomes that come from that action. In 26-27, we will start evaluating, and then it will be an every year evaluation. So these are the levels of accreditation. And again, determined yearly. And we're going to take you through the standards for each area, right, the measurements. But accredited, when you're accredited as a system in Kansas, what that means is your system on a yearly basis is meeting the standards in all 3 areas. Accredited with conditions, think of conditions as requirements. If you are accredited with conditions, that means that in at least one of those areas, one of those 3 areas, your system did not meet the standard. Okay, so that's accredited with conditions. And again, those conditions are requirements. Not accredited would mean that system is not meeting the conditions set forth by the State Board of Education. And we can talk more about examples if you need more of those things, but I just wanted the committee to understand those 3 different levels and the definitions of each of those. So I know there's been talk around pulling accreditation and those things like that. We've heard that. I think we need to talk about what that means. So when we look at this, we look at those 3. If a system reaches that level of being not accredited, that's a failure by more than just that system. When Ben talks about reciprocal accountability, we're going to hold you accountable, but we'll also hold ourselves accountable. If we have a system that is not accredited in Kansas, that's a failure by more than just that system. So we're going to intervene as much as we can, and I believe this model is a yearly, we're setting ourselves up to where we can yearly intervene with systems and provide the support they need. So compliance. The standard is pretty simple because the standard is set by the law. So the compliance areas in KESA are not all of the federal and state laws that pertain to schools. There's a handful of those. There's many federal and state statutes that systems comply with, but for KESA there are 14. And we look at those each year, and the standard is really set by the law. And then a lead team at KSDE that sets that standard and identifies clearly this is what it means to be in compliance, and this is what it means to be not in compliance. The measurement is really that measure of either in compliance or non-compliance. That's through an audit, whether an on-site audit or a desk audit of that system's information. And that is audited by our lead KSDE staff, and then the supports are provided by that same staff for those systems in compliance. And then outcomes, and then I'll turn this back over to Ben to talk about the school improvement side. But outcomes, there are 4 outcomes that we're looking at. There's graduation rate, there's what we call post-secondary effectiveness, and then there's ELA state assessment performance, math state assessment performance. Those are the 4 areas that we are looking at. We're setting standards for those right now. We have a draft of graduation standards that we'll take before the board this spring. We will have a draft of post-secondary standards that we'll take before the board this spring. With the state assessments in ELA and math, those are new state assessments this year. So until we set cut scores, right, after one taking of those state assessments, we're going to hold off setting standards until cut scores have been set. So what is a new level 1, level 2, 3, or 4? Then we will set standards. So later this year, most likely we'll have standards for state assessments. Those measures are really relative to 2 things. The established goals are state goals. If you can meet the standard in those areas by meeting our state goals, let's say 95% is our state goal for graduation. If you're at 95%, you're meeting that standard, or you are making improvement towards a state goal. Regardless of where you start, if you're at 75% graduation rate, as long as you, over time, every year, are incrementally improving towards that standard, you can meet the standard. Okay? We're very focused on improvement towards those state benchmarks. And then the supports really are the school improvement supports that we're providing for systems when you talk about outcomes. One thing I did fail to mention, the ARC before, our Accreditation Review Council, they would do a desk audit of systems In this model, when they're not meeting a standard, the ARC is going to do an on-site review. So it would be definitely a deeper look as opposed to just what's written on the page. So on-site reviews when systems are not meeting standards. Okay, I'll turn it back over to Ben, and we'll continue on with school improvement.
So as Jay said, the third component of the accreditation system is school improvement. And the same standard applies, that there is a standard. And you can see kind of the standard, especially for this year, it's engagement in what we call the KESA collaboration process. I'm going to walk you through that briefly. It's building an action plan that's aligned to a school improvement model, the document that you have in front of you, and we're going to walk through that briefly as well. And then moving towards implementation. We'll talk about how we measure implementation, which is the most important part. And our team, part of the shift at KSDE has been what I would describe as the ownership of this work across the entire division, especially of learning services. And we'll talk about just that action plan review. As Jay said, we didn't have frequent checks. Now we have checks of every single plan that comes in and a standard that we've applied. But the school improvement standards you can see there, and then anything that we would ask a system to do in terms of school improvement, we would have supports and resources for, and I can point the committee in the direction of where you can find those as well. So just to talk briefly, I've always felt like if you're going to ask, whether it's in a school system itself or across the state, if we're going to ask people to do things, let's see if we can get it on one page. And goes back to that idea of let's keep it simple. It's simple in idea, it's very difficult work. And I want to start just on the left side of this document. We call this the school improvement model. So it's our way of defining school improvement in Kansas. And it starts with this idea of what is fundamental. These are the things that we need to do exceedingly well if we're going to see outcomes improve substantially in our state. And it starts with literacy. We call it structured literacy. And we have a team that really established this as paramount as we think about our work. And it's building knowledge of our people, building knowledge of our educators, our parents, our families, on what good literacy instruction looks like, and being able to implement that every day in our classrooms. We know what the research is, and if you've ever met a second, third, fourth grader who is struggling with reading, and we don't address that, we know what those outcomes look like for those children. And so there's nothing more important that we can do than ensure we have quality literacy instruction. We also talk about standards alignment and clarity when it comes to all the standards that we have, being really clear about what we want our kids to know and be able to do. And we've been trying to do this work for a long, long time. And part of what we've established with this approach is the right resources and clarity around how to do that most effectively. And if we're going to measure based on state assessments, then we need to make sure that we're aligning practices to what is being measured. A balanced assessment approach. And we define that by having both the ability to assess students who are at risk for not achieving grade level standards, and also what are our standards reference measures, our formative assessments that we can measure progress not just at the end of a year when students are ready to move on, but throughout a school year, and making sure that we have good tools and resources to inform teachers based on the performance against standards throughout the year. That's a gap in a lot of our schools. And then quality instruction. Ensuring that we have high expectations in our classrooms, that we expect every student to be able to meet grade level standards. We've got good data to show us when that's not occurring, and we have good data to show us when it is. And we also believe that a fundamental element of quality instruction is having good quality resources for our teachers that are aligned to standards. And we believe if all of those four things are in place, firmly in place, then we're doing what we need to move outcomes. When we talk about the rest of the school improvement model under structures, those are the things that exist in all school systems across the state. Everybody's allocating resources, everybody's evaluating, everybody's doing some type of professional development. What we do on what we call school improvement days is we have the school system, the district leadership team from that school system evaluate the degree to which they do those things. So we ask them, how are you allocating resources towards the fundamentals? Specifically, how are you allocating resources towards professional development that is aligned to state standards, aligned to structured literacy, aligned to implementing high-quality instructional materials? How well are you doing that? And that team evaluates that, and we go down all of those structures asking those same questions. And it comes back to what is most fundamental. And I can tell you one of the challenges we have as we engage in this work and stay really tight with what we believe in this model is we have school systems that submit action plans that are good plans, and they're identifying good things, but they're not aligned to the model. They're not fundamental. And so we pull them back as our team reviews their action plans, we pull them back into what we believe creates the foundation for everything else that they can do. On the lead indicators, those are the actions that we believe are emblematic of doing those fundamentals really well. That's what we're asking each system to evaluate along with their data. How well are you doing these things? And then within that action plan, they establish measures of progress, meaning that if they're going to take action around structured literacy and they're going to do training in something like letters, which you've probably heard about, then how are you going to know that you're doing that thing? If you're going to onboard a standards referenced assessment as part of the balanced assessment approach so that your teachers know how students are performing against standards throughout the year, how do you know you're doing that thing? How are you going to measure that? Because in 6 months, we're going to come and we're going to ask you about it. Jay's team is going to sit down with that school system and say, are you making progress? Did you meet that 6-month mark? And if not, what do we need to adjust right now? Because in 1 year, you're going to come back with those peer systems, and you're going to talk about the progress that you're making. We're going to learn together, but that's where that high degree of accountability for action comes in. And so every 6 months, every 1 year, every 6 months, we're there to say, how are you doing? And if you're not meeting that standard for school improvement, then we're going to have supports and resources for you to ensure that you can do that. So when we leave those school improvement days, what we say is you have a lot of autonomy within this model to choose the right action for you right now, and then you have to do that thing. That's the accountability that we believe in for professional action, going back to our theory of action. And we'll talk just a little bit more about that as we get into the collaboration process. So it starts at the local level. It starts with having a strong district leadership team, building leadership team within that school system. Many of our schools have that in place. Some don't. And some have had to really shift the focus of those teams to talk about instruction and improving classroom practice. But it starts there. And then we have what we call a check-in. So that district leadership team, one of our staff members on Jay's team, we call them KESA regional executives. We've got one for each region of the state, goes into that school system. And really for this year, they're preparing them for that school improvement day. They're talking through what that school system can expect as we have a new model. And then number 3 that's highlighted there is this idea of a school improvement day. And that's where you have 3 to 5 what we call like school systems come together. We do these at service centers across the state. How many have we had so far this year, Jay?
55.
We've had 55 school improvement days, and we've trained 3 facilitators for each of those school improvement days. And we spend the entire day with these district leadership teams. Often there's 40 or 50 people in the room. And we start by talking about data. We specifically start having them look at their English language arts and math state assessment data. And we go through a data review process that includes ensuring that each school system knows where to access various types of data, whether that's state assessments, whether it's their own local data. We spend time on data. And then we move into that school improvement model. So we have a facilitator talk about data, we have a facilitator talk about school improvement, and they do that analysis, that gap analysis around all those fundamentals and lead indicators. And they start to determine where those gaps are. What does your data tell you? What's the gap in action related to those different indicators? And then we move into action planning during that afternoon. And that district leadership team works together. They also work with like colleagues in other districts, talking about what each other is doing, back to that idea of building a culture of collaboration. And at the end of that day, they start to set direction for their action plan. And I'll tell you what the components of that action plan are in just 1 second. And then they go back with their district leadership team and talk about how are we going to engage our broader school community in this conversation. So we don't believe that at that table, 7 or 8 or 10 people should set the plan. We think that they should have a good idea of where they want to go, and then they go back to their school community to talk about the direction that they want to go. And so from the time they have that school improvement day, they've got a chance to go back, engage their school community, and then within 60 days of that school improvement day, they submit that action plan to us. And then our team will review those action plans. So just very briefly, looking at that school improvement model, that's the basis. That document is the basis for the action plan. And what the school system is going to do is identify one or two of those fundamentals that they're going to focus attention on, that they're going to emphasize. It's really important to remember that you don't do structured literacy in the absence of understanding your standards, or understanding that you have to have a balanced approach to assessment, or understanding that you have to have quality instructional practices. They're not disconnected, they are highly connected, but within the action that you're going to take, we're asking you to identify what is most emphasized within that plan. And keeping it simple, you can identify 1 or 2 fundamentals. You're going to look at those structures like resource allocation, professional learning, professional collaboration, your tiered support system, the way you're engaging your community. You're going to look at all those different structures and say which of these is going to allow us to emphasize that fundamental most successfully. What's the right action for us based on our data, based on that gap analysis they do on that school improvement day, many of whom are doing that prior to. And then they're going to look at the measures. How are we going to know? If we're doing professional learning related to structured literacy, how are we going to measure that? What are we going to look at? You're probably going to look at the number of people who are trained, and you're going to set targets where you want to be in 6 months and where you want to be in 1 year. And that goes into that action plan, and we ask for 3 short answer responses. One is, why is this the right action for you? We think that that's a really important starting point. What does your data tell you? What does your analysis of action tell you? And then what's the current evidence or data related to that action? It may be something new for them. It may be something that they're continuing on. And then what's the next right action? Not the next step you're going to take within this plan, but the research behind this model that you see in front of you is that action cannot occur in isolation. Back to that idea of if we're going to teach literacy most effectively, you don't just train, you have to align your resources. You have to make sure that you have high degrees of data literacy. You've got to make sure that you have tiered supports in place in order to support the students who need additional time and support. And so action has to reinforce action, and that's why this is a long-range look at school improvement in Kansas. You can't just do one thing and expect results. You have to build upon that action. So with that district leadership team, we're always asking them to understand that you've got to be thinking about the next action to complement that action that you're taking right now. So when those action plans come in, we've got a team that reviews every single one of them, and this is hard work. This is part of the adjustment that we've made at the State Department. I love Jay's term, reciprocal accountability. We're going to do everything we can to support school systems, especially in this first year, to get off to the right start. And so the challenge with that has been making sure that it's clear, a clear action plan, that it's highly aligned, that it's completely aligned to that school improvement model. And this is where we get into really good things that aren't highly aligned. And I'll give you just one very brief example. Recently, we had an action plan submitted that was all around cooperative learning. If you know cooperative learning, that's where students sit in groups and they interact with one another. And that's a really important part of learning together, learning to interact with others. And I've been in a district that emphasized cooperative learning very successfully. And so they had a good plan. And what we said was cooperative learning in and of itself is fine, but if your teachers don't know their standards, if they don't know how to teach literacy most effectively, if they don't know how to use data, if we don't have aligned materials and don't expect each student to meet high standards, cooperative learning is not going to be highly effective. But if you do have those things in place, cooperative learning probably will work very well. And that's where we're pulling people back into what's most fundamental. And that's really hard because the school system might say, we know better, that you're the State Department. We know better than you what we need to do. And in a lot of ways, that's absolutely true, but we've established a definition for school improvement, and it includes those things on that left side of the page that will enhance everything else we do. And so those conversations, that's what we've engaged in. I'm so proud of our team because we haven't relinquished that. Because it'd be very easy for us to say, it's a good plan, but we're staying very true to that model. And that's what this action plan review process now looks like. So here's just a little bit of data as we close out and would love to answer your questions for you. Again, we're in year one. We really worked to transition from an old model where we were asking people to do a lot of different things. And I would argue those things weren't as focused on instruction as we needed them to be. We've transitioned to a new model, and this year we're executing on that model, and so far, we're in March already. We've had 163, this is probably about a week old, we're probably above 163 action plans that have been submitted. So these are school systems that are accredited through the state board that have submitted their action plans. So they've gone through the check-in process, school improvement days, they've engaged their school community and submitted those plans to us. The number of components, remember, you can have up to 2 components. You can keep it super simple. You can try to do a few different things, but keeping it simple this year, many have said we're going to do one thing really well. And we're challenging them to think about what's the next action constantly as they establish their priority for this year. And then the number of structures that have been chosen. So if we're doing structured literacy, just as an example of where we're emphasizing, then you may choose professional learning as the structure that allows you to do that. You may choose professional collaboration. The number one combination that we've seen so far this year is structured literacy with professional learning. And that's to be expected, as that's something that we have emphasized. Just a little bit more data. You'll notice that standards alignment, quality instruction, structured literacy are heavy favorites in terms of the fundamentals that are being emphasized. Not as many with balanced assessment. We think that'll start to change over time as we get some other things in place. And then those structures, really high degrees of professional learning right now. So this is just where systems have identified their priorities based on the model, based on the data, based on the gap analysis that they've done on those school improvement days, based on their engagement with their school community. Just a little bit of information that we continue to collect on a daily basis. If you want to see information, so just pointing you in the direction of where to find a lot of these resources, if you go to the KSDE homepage and you click on accreditation, which is over on the right side of the page, you'll see lots of resources related to our new accreditation model. One that's highlighted there, we call them exemplar action plans or model action plans. Those action plans that have come in that we would say are meeting all the marks in an exceptional way. That's a good point of reference for anybody who wants to know more about this process, and certainly for those school systems who are identifying priorities that maybe others have already established. And so we see these things as just good resources, ways to learn more about what it is that we're doing in KESA 2.0. And then just as we close out here, this is our director team. This is really where this process started within our team and has branched out across our division, across our agency. And with that, Madam Chair, I'm happy to answer any questions from the committee.
Thank you. I will kick us off with one. When you say that you only want to hold school systems accountable for what we can support, can you define support or paint a picture for me of exactly what you mean by that?
Sure. So kind of going back to that idea of fundamentals, I'm going to get back to that school improvement model here. So when you look at those 4 fundamentals of structured literacy, standards alignment, balanced assessment, quality instruction, we're really establishing supports and resources for each of those things. So if we're going to ask people to pursue this idea of structured literacy or quality literacy instruction, we need to make sure that we have the resources available to the school system so they know how to do that most effectively. Right now, we have a LETTERS initiative, and we have around 12 to 13,000 teachers who have gone through or are going through LETTERS. And so that'd be an example of a support or resource that we want to make sure is available to our educators who are establishing structured literacy within their system. With standards alignment are what we call our program managers. So we've got an individual who oversees all of our English language arts standards, all of our math standards, science standards, fine arts standards, in all of our content areas. And what they've done as a shift in the type of work we do at KSDE is they've created what we call standards alignment toolkits. So if you've been in schools much or maybe worked as an educator, you've probably experienced, much like me, years and years and years of trying to align classroom practice with standards. And oftentimes that's done in the school system, trying to establish how we align practices or lessons to standards. And most of the time, I think we've fallen short when it comes to the measures that we use. So we're disappointed with the results. And what we said as we moved to this model, that we need to do standards alignment most effectively, and that's where the establishment of these standards alignment toolkits it's a new process for us, but those have been established. And the really exciting part of that, if you're familiar with our regional service centers, all of that training is done in conjunction with a KSDE staff member and a service center staff member. And that's how we'll sustain that work over time. Because a lot of our smaller school systems especially receive supports from the service center. And I've had service center staff members tell me over the years they're really focused on aligning curriculum, aligning to standards. And they say, we don't know if it's the approach that KSDE would take. And now we've joined those together. So it's one and the same. And what the reports that we've received from our content area people across the state is we have high quality resources in this area. So those are two examples. I could go through all of them. The balanced assessment system, we've got interim assessments and mini tests that allow teachers to see how students are performing against standards throughout the year. Those have been available for a long time, but they haven't been employed by a lot of school systems, and certainly not in a systemic way. That's what's happening in Manhattan today. So this morning I was able to welcome a group of about 150 educators who are attending an assessment conference in Manhattan, and that's what they're talking about today. So and that's new. That's a part of the shift that we made. So each of those areas that we say you have to do exceedingly well, we need to have supports for them. I could go into quality instruction, but I know I'm talking a lot. So.
Thank you. I'm going to ask one more question and then make sure I give others an opportunity to ask. I noticed we had two charts, and that far right column is different on each one of them. And also where we say measure, I think I'm interested in hearing what specific measures are, even if that needs to be a separate document we get later. Is there a reason they don't match? Or which column do we utilize?
The smaller document. So we accidentally pulled an older document. We just wanted you to be able to see it. And yours was underneath a stack, and I didn't want to move your stack. I think we got everybody else changed out.
Nobody else knows what I'm talking about. Okay.
Probably, yeah. We've had, lots of iterations. But, the smaller document, the one that says measures of progress, 6-month and 1-year target is the correct one.
Okay, thank you. And you can get us a fully comprehensive list of what the measure is for each one of those.
Yes, and Madam Chair, if you click on that model action plan or exemplar action plan, you're going to see those, what at least the school systems have established as their measures. We have what we call pre-built measures, so things that are kind of a menu that a school system can select, or they can choose their own. But those are all, very well established. We can certainly get those to the committee.
Thank you. Representative Hubert.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm going to ask a kind of a global question and see how it fits into this improvement model. When we talk about structured literacy and then we talk about accountability, sometimes we look at graduation rates and even issues like social promotion, where students are being promoted to the next level even though they're not at reading level. I asked this question years ago and didn't get a good answer, but when I worked at Boeing and we were working with training, and people were bringing in new systems that required some skills, we had to work with those people to basically get the reading level down to sixth grade level in order for those people to be able to learn the skills they needed to do. And so with all that we're talking about and how we're wanting to improve our literacy rates, what are we doing with accountability and school districts to make sure we're getting to the point where a high school diploma doesn't mean reading at a sixth grade level?
It's a great question. I would say that the first thing that we're doing is prioritizing it. And when we talk about accountability, I really like that term. It's something that every school system is now having to evaluate. And what's been interesting in my experience is going across the state really 2-3 years ago and talking about structured literacy, you still had people who I think were trying to wait out maybe the state board or the State Department, and like, we're not really going to go down that path. It seems maybe like a fad, you know, something like that. And we keep coming back and saying the same thing. And I think it's universally across the board now understood that this isn't going away, and that it must be prioritized. And when we look at our data, it's clear that while many children are readers, they're not effective enough, or they have what we would call limited ability, and therefore there are certain things that we have to do. I think a challenge with maybe the premise of the question, there have been states who have adopted statewide retention policies. And while, you know, we know that transition as students move from second, third to fourth grade, we know that's a critical point. And I think that the challenges become the unintended consequences of keeping students back if they're not demonstrating those skills. But that's the type of standard that could be established. But I would say that's why we're doing the work that we're doing and prioritizing that. And the ability to identify students who are at risk for failure has to happen right away at those earliest age levels. And that's the work of the best educator I've ever worked with is Dr. Lori Curtis, who oversees this work at the State Department, and that's what she does every single day, and that's what her team does every single day. And back to that idea of coherence building, if all of us can decide this is the direction that we want to go and create that type of accountability for actions to change, I believe that that'll start to address the problem that you're seeing as students are moving on.
Thank you for that answer, and I do appreciate the priority, and I think we all agree how important it is. My next question is dealing with the balanced assessments, and I know even when I chaired this committee, I asked the Department of Education to give me an explanation and consider looking at the assessments we do for history, social studies, and civics, because we had dropped the objective assessments and moved to a subjective assessments model, which doesn't have a lot of data. And I was very surprised that that decision would be made like that without involving the legislature in that decision. I've asked for that to be reconsidered and reinstated. Are we any closer to the point of considering looking at returning an assessment that provides objective data in history, social studies, and civics?
I don't know if we're any closer. I don't know where we've been, you know, historically.
Maybe that's when you can ask Randy about and get back an answer to me.
Certainly can. I would just quickly say that, you know, whether it's through a summative test or through just the prioritization of standards, our students' ability to know and demonstrate skills related to history and social studies, government, all those things is absolutely critical. And I know our team sees it that way. So I'll get back with you on the assessment where we would be, you know, as far as that goes. But on the standards alignment piece, we see that as again, the critical work that we have to do.
I was never given an answer, even when it was done, why it was done without coordination and why they felt like it was acceptable. Thank you.
Let's make sure we move on. In the queue right now, I have Schreiber, Steele, Hill, Pishney, and Getz. Representative Schreiber.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thanks for the presentation. I think you'd mentioned right at the beginning 303 systems, 304. So does that include the online schools, or because that doesn't match up with the number of districts?
If they're in, yeah, I'll let Jay, he knows the numbers.
So we have 286 public school districts, but private systems, and we call them systems, right? Because it's a school system. Private systems have the choice of going through KISA for state accreditation. So that additional number are our private schools that choose to go through KISA.
Okay. All right, thank you.
And when you have like a diocese, you have multiple schools. So you can't always think of a private school as its own entity. Representative Steele?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you both for your presentation, very enlightening. You mentioned that the state assessments were changing. What were the specific changes with those?
So we call them enhanced and refreshed. So standards have not changed. So the assessments are built on the same standards that we've had in place. We've had basically the same questions on the assessment for the last 10 years. So the decision was made quite a few years ago to refresh the types of assessment items or the type of assessment questions that are asked on those things. So that's the primary difference in the assessments is we have new questions that are based on the same standards.
So if they're based on the same standards, what's the need to adjust the cut scores?
Well, I think I don't know that there'll be much of a shift in where the cut scores are, but they'll go through a process where they look at the questions. They call it the bookmarking approach. They'll look at all the questions and line them up from easiest to most difficult, and then they'll establish where they think that separation point is based on the different performance descriptors. That was the same process they went through last time. So since we have the same standards, and we have the same process, I believe that we'll see a lot of parallels between what we currently have and what we will have in the future.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Representative Hill?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Ben, always good to see you. Thanks for coming and talking to us about a rather complex situation. You mentioned several times through your presentation about your desire for simplicity and finding the salient points. And I'm reminded of what our charge in the Constitution is for education. Do you know what that is? It's a 4-part charge. Do you know what those?
You can remind me.
Okay. It says that we are to develop a education system that provides for the academic, intellectual, scientific, and vocational education of children. Okay? As I understand that your presentation and Dr. J's presentation are essentially theoretical level. You're telling us how you go through this more on a theoretical level than a practical level. But my concern is, as a representative, my parents at home, my community people at home, and when I go to them and say, well, accreditation is built off of a collaborative effort involving a community and discussion amongst many stakeholders, that doesn't fly. I can't sell that. Can you tell me in a simplified term what people should be expecting out of their schools, particularly in relationship to those 4 areas we're charged with?
So while I think in order to build the model, we had to have a premise, and that's maybe the theoretical side. But I would describe this as a highly practical model, and maybe I didn't convey that very well. And I think the collaborative nature, we feel like starts to build the capacity and understanding of anybody who wants to engage and support what's happening in our schools. But to be very specific, as far as what this model does in a practical sense is it elevates the most fundamental or foundational elements of what I believe each school system should do to meet those obligations that you mentioned. And it starts with, again, that ability to ensure that each child is an effective reader, because that's how you acquire most everything else that you need to know to be successful, not only in school but beyond. And I think the value of standards, when I think about the Kansas state standards, it's what gives each student across the state access to things that make the experience equitable, no matter if you're in far western Kansas in a small district or this part of the state or wherever you are. We should expect each student to meet those high standards that we've established in Kansas. And that evaluation is being done by every school system to determine if they're doing that. And if not, you need to do that. And if you don't have data to show whether or not that those students are meeting those grade level standards, then you've got to ensure that you acquire that data and then use it most effectively. And if you don't have teachers in your classrooms that expect each student to meet those grade level standards, and we're not equipping them with resources, then you have to do that thing. So I don't know how to make a statewide process more practical to achieve academically and intellectually and scientifically and through opportunities to explore career than that approach. So this is the very best effort that we could establish to make something that is theoretical. We believe, our belief is, the why behind it is, if we do these things, our students will know more and be able to do more. And the practical side is ensuring that each system does an evaluation of where they're at in that continuum and decide what the right action is for them based on this model. So it's our best attempt to move from theoretical to practical in those 4 areas and the actions that are associated with those things. So that'd be my best response.
Thank you very much.
Very, very quickly, because we've got a long queue and not much time.
Okay, one more rather quick question. When you were going through the 3 areas that accreditation is based on, I forget what the first one, it was kind of a planning type of situation. And then you had outcomes, and then you had school improvement model. I can't remember what you called the first one. What was it?
Compliance.
Compliance, yeah, okay, so with federal law. And I looked at those, and then I looked at that you can be conditionally accredited by achieving 2 of those 3 areas. Am I correct on that?
You could be accredited with the condition for failing to meet any of the 3.
Yes. Okay. So outcomes being the one that really where the rubber meets the road. I mean, if we don't have outcomes out of schools, they're just going through the motions. And so I thought about that, and I wondered, how is it that we could have a system of accreditation that there could be absolutely no outcomes and yet a school could still be conditionally accredited? Could you explain that to me?
So if they're not achieving the outcome standard, they would be accredited with the condition that they're not achieving that outcome standard. And so we would identify by going into the school system, so that's where the ARC that Jay talked about would go into the school system to identify where is the deficit. And we would work with them to leverage supports to address that deficit. So if they're not meeting a standard for English language arts, testing that particular outcome, then we would say we've got supports and resources that need to be employed in that school system to improve that particular outcome. So that's going back to this premise that we need to have supports and resources. It's built on the belief that our schools and our leaders, our educators, our teachers are doing the very best work they can. Maybe they need additional supports to do that work. And so that'd be an example of where we want to employ those additional supports.
Okay, I appreciate your answer, but I would finish off with a comment that I believe if we are not seeing outcomes that are reasonable and expectable, there should be no accreditation. That should be an absolute requirement that we have outcomes. I appreciate that you need to comply and that you need to have improvement, which I don't know how you could have improvement without outcomes, but it seems like that's a baseline that you have to have for all schools.
The chair's going to jump in here and announce that on Friday, we will have a roundtable. So I think I want to keep us focused in on our questions about this, because I think your line of thought is appropriate for Friday. And I appreciate everybody's willingness to be part of that conversation. But I do want to get through the rest of our question list. Representative Pishney?
I'll try to be fairly brief, Madam Chair, and thank you. But to give you some context, I'm a student of policy governance, and in policy governance, we're focused on outcomes, and we really don't care much about how the means or what means are used to accomplish those outcomes, as long as they're not illegal, imprudent, or unethical in the broadest sense. And so I'm looking at outcomes and results. And I don't know if this is your mission statement or just a slogan, but Kansas leads the world in success of each student. I've been staring at that during the entire presentation. And another thing in policy governance is reasonable interpretation. And my reasonable interpretation of that success of each student is that they'll be a positive contributor of our economic and social well-being. Is that how you determine success of each student, and are these aligned with results? Because I'm hearing more about the means and how we're going to get there and some of those things in the presentation that I'm hearing, and I'm not sure that they're going to lead to the results for positive contributors, because so many students are getting out of K through 12 or even out of college, and they're not ready for the workplace. And we hear that from the workforce people all the time. So I don't know if you understand my question that's embedded in all those comments or not.
I think what you just said, that right now we have too many young people who are graduating who are not prepared, is the reason why we made this change. That's my belief. So we can talk about just telling people to do better and get outcomes. We've been doing that for a long time. It hasn't worked. I think we have to show them a path, and I believe that that's what this is. So if we don't like where we're at right now, I would argue, as we said from the outset, this is a completely different approach. We have positive momentum. You also have to understand how people receive the work, and I don't think we have a lot of educators that are saying, we like this approach because it's easier. In fact, I think in a lot of ways it's more difficult for most of our school systems. In the old accreditation model, and I came from a district that would fall into this category, we didn't have to worry about accreditation because we were always going to achieve at a much higher rate in any measure than what the state average was. With this, there is a place for every single school system, whether you're the tiniest district or the largest, and everybody has to be accountable to take the types of action that are going to change what I think will be meaningful for students as they go through school, and then when they graduate, that they will have more skills. They'll have more abilities. We won't be having the same conversations about teaching, graduated students at a sixth grade reading level because we prioritize that work. This is not a short order change, however. It takes time. And that's where I think all of us deciding that we're going to hold people accountable to take these actions. These are not arguable. And we went out for several years and said, if you don't agree that we should hold you accountable to teach your children to read most effectively and around standards and being clear about those things, say it now, because this is the direction that we're going. And we heard over and over, we can accept being held accountable to these things. So I think if we're going to change that outcome, I think we have a good approach to be able to do that here.
And one follow-up question, Madam Chair. Does this accountability take into account the difference, or I wrote down variations in student demographics? I'm in Finney County, so you understand part of my reason for this question. And with regard to the reading, which I do believe is the basis for academic and work success, the fact that students are moving in and out because of the demographics primarily. Does this accountability and so forth take into account some of those factors?
It does, and that's part of the reason we have to sit down with the school system and not just have them report aggregate data. So sitting down and understanding that context is a part of this model.
Okay. Thank you, Madam Chair. Appreciate your indulgence.
Representative Getz, Brantley, and Stogsdill.
Thank you much, Madam Chair. And been we're kind of sorry we hear we might be losing you, and I'm a little sad about that, but, because I think you've done a good job, but good luck in your next endeavors. My question really is around, so this change it's almost from an Olympics every 4, 5, 6 years, like what you talked about, mindset, into an every 6 months trying to win a championship. And that comes with kind of a big shift in personnel, resources, mindset. Those are, I have kind of 3 questions, but I think you can ask them in this restructuring to 2.0, which I think most in this room are going to say, yes, hallelujah. We're so glad that something in this direction is happening, that we're taking this part seriously. Staff, how many, and from when, how it was on a 5 or 6 year, now it's at 6 months. We have a lot more staff working on this, and you're going to a conversational model from a data reporting model, which that's almost can be impersonal with a little bit of analytics on the back end. That seems like it should be a huge shift in the staff proportion, that if we're going to pull this off, it needs to be rightly structured to be successful. And then resource dollars inside the department, has that really shifted to, and where has that shift come from? And then what in this move to 2.0, what has been the hardest thing? I guess is just kind of my mind in the back. This is a big change to the department. And what has that look like on the backside? I see the sheets here, and they don't disagree with them, maybe some tweaks here and there, but the structural back end of it to sustain this, will you talk me through some of that as you can? I know we don't have unlimited time.
I'll do my best to be very brief. I would say back to when I came on board at KSDE, one of the things that we learned from our staff, and we've got a number of people who work on a lot of things and work really hard, but they told us that we don't always see the connection back to that vision. We don't always see the connection of our work to the vision, or we don't always see the connection of our work to what other people maybe just across the way are doing at KSDE. So that's part of the coherence building process. So there are people, a number of people, who do different daily work. I mentioned our program managers as a good example. They were doing a lot of professional development across the state, but I would say impact was very isolated, the people that were signing up for it. And now we're creating something for every school system to receive across Kansas when it comes to standards alignment, and that's their job. And so those are the types of shifts that we've seen. I would argue that while we'll continue to learn and evolve in this model, we have the capacity to execute exactly what we presented to you today. If we can't execute on that, that would have been addressed before we brought this model out. So some of that is shifts in the nature of the work. It has been reallocation of dollars and time that our staff gives to certain priorities. But all of that is within our capacity to execute. Jay's team has changed significantly. He has individuals, one that lives out west, one that lives in the central part of the state, one that lives in the eastern part of the state, that goes out to visit with school systems on a daily basis. And so that's, when we say this has been a shift, we have shifted those resources to be able to accomplish exactly what we presented to you today, and believe that we can sustain that over time. I would invite the committee again, you know, just little tweaks. Why did you ask this? Or why did you? We want people to be involved. If you want to attend a school improvement day, I will tell you, I've been to 7 or 8, and 2 of those I would describe as the best days I've experienced in 25 years in education, because the depth of analysis that schools were doing for an entire day around all the things that matter for kids. And that's where those facilitators, so we've had 160 volunteers say, we will help you execute on these school improvement days. We have 3 at each site, and you get to see what that sequencing is throughout that day, just based on others that have stepped in to support the work as well. So I believe all those supports and resources we can sustain, the people can sustain them.
Representative Brantley.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for being here today and presenting. I absolutely agree that 2.0 is much better than 1.0, just in the fact that evidence that they load is at least showing some productivity of what's going on in the school. I have a question, 2 questions. First, on the math standards, They were not updated last year due to the state assessments being written until May of '25, is that correct?
I believe so.
So are the new assessments used this year, or will they be used next year?
The new assessments will be used this year.
So you'll set the cut scores this year on those. So will the math standards be looked at next year?
I'm not sure exactly what our schedule is. I can bring that that timeline back to the committee.
Okay.
Get you that information. But yes, those assessments, those new assessments will be provided this spring.
All right, next question. I'll make it fast. On the KISA, and before you guys come in, I like to do my homework and make sure that I'm on the same page. So when I went to do my homework, and please clarify with me, I don't know if you can do that on your phone and such, I put in the KSDE KISA, and we are fully implemented into the 2.0, am I correct?
Yes.
So all of the 1.0 is in the past. So my question would be then, are the KISA foundations still used? Is that piece still a part of KISA 2.0?
Foundational structures. I would say yes. Those are all a part of KISA. Well, I shouldn't say all of them. The foundational structures, a lot of them go back to standards. A lot of them go back to Rose capacities. And so when we were building this for the board, and Mrs. Hopkins could speak to this very well, those different components that were part of the original KISA were all addressed as part of that build when we were asked to come back every single month and talk about those things. So primarily, those foundational structures will be described in our standards alignment process. We don't use the term foundational structures in KISA 2.0. So some of that terminology has shifted.
So would the reflection rubrics and such still be continued as part of that foundation piece?
We feel like those can all be useful tools, but those aren't, we're not demanding that anybody evaluate themselves against those types of tools.
Okay, so then earlier you mentioned reciprocal accountability. And can you clarify that, make sure I'm understanding that piece correctly?
Yeah, so there's a kind of a research base of that, but it's this idea, again, back to that core principle of not creating an accountability model unless we can provide supports for doing the things within that model. So we take ownership, just like the school systems are taking ownership of those four fundamental elements within that school improvement model.
Okay, so last week we mentioned some areas of concern, and I felt like it was just kind of dismissed. And I'm going to kind of quote from what I noticed. Did you guys have a webinar recently on the DEI at KSDE? And it says the Kansas State Department of Education will not issue guidance, according to a KSDE spokesperson in a recent state affairs report.
I'm sorry, that'd be outside of my area.
Okay,
I'm not familiar
so
with that.
it said KSDE is leaving decision-making on the handling of DEI content in the hands of local. So if DEI is left to the local, when I actually did my research on the KISA information and pulled up the foundation structure rubrics, I found that it states diversity, equity, and inclusion, and I'm really concerned with that reciprocal accountability, that we are to oversee things just like we do in our homes. If you guys are overseeing those local districts, and that's been turned, the DEI has been turned over to the local districts, it's still in the KISA piece, and I have some real concerns there, and I don't want any long-term effects, but I just want to bring that to your awareness and make sure we take care of those things.
If I could, Madam Chair, that was a foundational structure in KISA 1.0. That is not something, in terms of the foundational structures, primarily, as I mentioned, those are found in standards. That particular foundational structure is not a part of KISA 2.0. If that's, our website has some deficiencies. We have lots of information on there. We feel like there's a lot of rubrics and tools and resources people can utilize, but just to be clear, that's not a part of the new accreditation model.
Thank you. Well, my basic search was KSDE, KISA, and this is what popped up. So I just wanted to clarify that we have that accountability, that we're not leading the local districts astray, that they may have some consequences that we wouldn't want to come from them. Thank you.
I think the concern is if the injunction gets lifted off of funding and if a local school district sees it on y'all's site, then they might have it, and we don't want anyone to lose their federal funding. Representative Stogsdill.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My question is, this whole process, and I like what I'm reading here today, but this is all based on a 9-month school year, isn't it?
You'll have to maybe tell me more based on the 9-month school year.
Most of the school districts in the state run on a 9-month system, which is, in my opinion, an antiquated agrarian calendar that's used in 1825, 1925, and we're still using it in 2025. When we're talking about, you know, with some kids not getting up to where we want them in a 9-month school year, we've got 3 months with hundreds of millions of dollars worth of school buildings and that sort of thing that go unused. Has the department looked at anything as to maybe how we could better utilize that time in the summer to do something? Because I'm remember you said just a couple of words hit my mind, and it was held back. And I visited several school districts in Illinois. As a matter of fact, I taught classes at K-State in open year-round schools. And it just amazes me that we never consider the school calendar that we use to get the results that we want to use. And I'm just wondering if there's been any discussion about that at the State Department.
I think the discussions probably are more around the types of extended learning opportunities that we can provide to students. I don't know that we've taken a position on how long a school year should be, but there are lots of good examples, and some states have really embraced extended learning into the summer months. So I think those types of models are something that we could make available, certainly understanding the things that you can do around literacy with students who may be struggling throughout the school year. So appreciate the question.
I agree, because I've thought with particularly if we get the reading centers going, that ELP and cross-training is just a wonderful opportunity to have a big impact. I am going to go to Representative McNorton after I say something, because I think we run the risk of everybody bolting out of here after his question. I want to say that I'm very pleased that there is a strong sense of urgency with this and the checking every 6 months. I really appreciate that the department is thinking outside of the box and off of a 5-year cycle to a every year cycle. I'm wondering if we're having a little bit of disconnect in the conversation today on the outcomes, because you guys are still setting them, and why we might be sounding like, hey, we want much more detail on measurement and outcome. And so as long as we're on that, I would also, you mentioned state assessments, which I think do give us certain information, but we lose the ability to have a cohort comparison, because those same kids are not in third grade overwhelming amount of the time to get the next test. So we don't see cohort improvement. So I hope when we hear outcome that we get a chance to see like some formative and cohort improvement. Just my 2 cents. Representative McNorton.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So I had just a question, a little 2-part question here. So if a district or a system, as you say, is not accredited, what triggers that and what's the consequences?
I'm going to have Jay come up because we talked about that.
So again, the 3 levels, right? Accredited with conditions, and then not accredited. If a system reaches the point where they're, not accredited by the State Board of Ed, that means that they have not met the conditions that were set out for their accredited with conditions, which could be outcomes. It could be compliance issues. It could be school improvement, right? Any of those 3 areas could impact their accreditation status. So here are and this is in reg, if a system is not accredited in Kansas, these are the options, right? The first one is the legislature abolishes or restructures the school district. So if you pull accreditation, which I've seen that term mentioned, if you pull accreditation, these are the options. The legislature could abolish that school district. They could reduce the state funding for that district, and the amount that's reduced goes on to the local property taxes for that district. So they pick up the cost. There's a state technical assistance team that's formed, and they go in and basically take over that district. The local board reassigns personnel or they reallocate funding. So the local board would restructure. And then, and that's all, these are all the four options. And the fifth option is that there's a notification and a press release across the state.
Thank you. Also, what's your target or goal where a system doesn't need an action plan? Do you have something if they're doing well enough that they don't have to be on an action plan?
Well, the action plan in this case, everybody has an action plan. So everybody, part of the model is the school improvement side is submitting an action plan. That's what you're sharing with the state, right? In terms of this is what we're doing for KISA, our action plan. If it's an intervention action plan, if you're not meeting a standard, that would be a separate thing. So everybody has an action plan, but if you're not meeting a standard, yeah. If you're not meeting a standard, there could be some additional.
What if, what's your standard that if you're meeting all those, do you need an action? I mean, do you need an action plan if you're getting the outcomes, you're compliant and everything that you want us to do? Do they still need to do an action plan every 6 months?
Yes, the action plan is the school improvement side of KISA is the action plan itself.
Okay.
So that's what we're looking at over time as you move year to year.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
I almost wondered at first if you were asking, like, what does it take, what measurements and standards are you meeting to not need conditional accreditation? And I think that's part of the detail that I know I would like more information on that, and I would appreciate if you would email to us the link to the regulation that you read and referenced.
We'll for sure do that. And we are currently setting standards. We already have the standards done for compliance because those are the same year to year. We're setting standards for implementation of your action plan. That's when I say meeting the standards for school improvement, that's what I mean. If a system's not meeting those standards, then they would need, we would intervene and support them differently. Same thing for the outcome standards. We'll make sure we have those. We're running those by the state board this spring, the graduation and post-secondary. Later this year will be state assessment standards.
Okay, thank you very much. I think that's the end of our discussion on KISA 2.0. Is there anything else for anybody for the good of the order? Okay, in that case, we are dismissed late today. We finished early last week and late today.